Greetings, friends of liberty. As you all are no doubt well aware, some short while ago in France, they had a figure of monstrous import, that of, as the French say, Maximilien Robespierre, the dictator who slaughtered by the thousands those who disagreed with his ideology. Nicknamed the Incorruptible, Robespierre's morality was in truth so evil that it lent corruption a good name. And further, how may a man who claims he supports direct democracy, in accordance with that rogue Rousseau, exercise a dictatorship in which only he and a few others rule? Where is the democracy, the universal suffrage, the expression of the popular will, in that? Further, when we turn to your 20th century, in this book published not a year ago by Nancy Dougherty, The Hangman and His Wife, we have the portrayal of a man whose heart was just like that of Robespierre's, but whose victims numbered not in the tens of thousands, but millions. I speak of the Nazi Reinhard Heydrich, who, along with Heinrich Himmler, was one of the two chief administrators of the SS and architects of the Holocaust. Miss Dougherty begins in her very first paragraph by highlighting the dual nature of her book. She says, its story focuses on two people who were both members of the Nazi Party. One of them, Reinhard Heydrich, was a remarkable man by any reckoning and was responsible for a remarkable amount of suffering. The other, Heydrich's wife, Lina, represented the other side of the Nazi coin, the quiet supporters of the leadership. She was responsible for nothing except that she built a household for her husband and did her best to back him in every way possible. The purpose of this dual focus is to better understand the nature of Heydrich's evil and the psychology of these two intertwined people. As she says, the Nazis' greatest failing may be described as a failure of empathy. They simply refused to regard inconvenient or troublesome people, mainly Jews, as human beings. It seems to me that these sins are not confined to the population of Germany between 1933 and 1945. To treat the Nazis as less than human is to repeat a sickening mistake. And in these words, she's exactly right. Indeed, her biography couldn't succeed as well as it has otherwise. She proceeds in her quest for understanding by giving us a brief introduction and overview of Reinhardt's career, the Heydrich couple's first meeting with Hitler, and the Nazi obsession with the image of the ideal Aryan, of which Heydrich was an excellent example, his death mask having been used in 1942 on a famous Nazi postage stamp. Reinhard and Lina were even pictured in Nazi mythology, Lina describing how a famous painting made by the artist Wilrich of the two Heydrichs together outside in a garden, they both wearing country costume and she suckling an infant, became a problem because of her quasi-nakedness. The author, in her attempt to find out what Lina thought of the subsequent scandal, encountered the typical evasiveness Lina sometimes expressed when directly asked. I tried to pull her back to the subject of Wilrich's portrait of her. Wasn't it a scandal to be on the cover of the magazine Volk and Rasse? I had the impression that your husband was unhappy over that picture. Frau Heydrich refused to take the bait. She took the time to pour us each a glass of wine. Yes, you mean the one by Wietze. No, Wilrich. Yes, but my husband found Wilrich abominable, detestable. Yes, painting is a special thing. Sometimes it is toil, and sometimes it is dabbling. This was a type of meandering evasiveness that Lina could exhibit that the author had to navigate in conducting her interviews. She then turns to present us with Heydrich the killer, the organizer of genocide. Why was he so good at killing on an epic and unimaginable scale? Because partly, strange as it may seem, as a head of Nazi intelligence, he utterly understood the inescapable value of knowledge. As Dougherty says, Much of Heydrich's incessant activity had to do with the gathering, analyzing, and processing of information about other people. "Do you know what the inscription over this house ought to be?" he once asked a subordinate at police headquarters. "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here?" "No," said Heydrich, "knowledge is power." Her introduction completed, our author soon turns to his childhood, with Reinhard growing up with a brother, Heinz, and a sister, Maria, in Halle, in the German state of Saxony. She describes his father, Bruno, a well-known philandering opera singer and composer, and his mother, Elizabeth, also educated in music and in a finishing school in Switzerland. Reinhard, as a child, was active and mischievous, learned fencing early, and partly because he was teased at school for his squeaky voice, learned instead to play the violin superbly. Incidentally, while growing up, there were rumors that his father had Jewish relatives, and so he was teased by other children about this, as well as his voice. In 1922, having joined the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, while stationed at Kiel on the North Sea, he mastered sailing, becoming both the North Sea and Baltic champion. He was also apparently the only cadet with a violin, and as through much of his life, was skilled not only on the violin strings, but at playing on female heartstrings. After an apparent misunderstanding with a young lady as to whether they would marry, which occurred in his room late at night, her father complained about his behavior to his commanding officer, and after hearing, Reinhard was dishonorably discharged. Incidentally, when the author asked Lina about this, she said evasively, "I have written about this rather precisely in my book," ignoring the fact that the book hadn't been published yet. Reinhard then decided to join Himmler's SS a year later in 1931, impressing Himmler at once in person with his Nazi demeanor and Aryan looks. Lina, however, said about this, "My husband wasn't at all determined to make a good impression on Himmler. He wanted only to have a position to earn his bread." When the author asked her later, "Then why did he join the SS?" Lina replied, "That was very simple. When my husband separated from the Navy, he could only work in a military, soldierly organization, and there was only the SS." In any case, whether out of necessity or desire, he quickly rose up the ranks, showing himself adept at gathering valuable information on the various political and paramilitary groups, both friendly and hostile, that he encountered in Weimar Germany. Heydrich's enormous ambition, seemingly unlimited reserves of energy, and ferocious intellect led others to quickly sense the depth of his abilities. As Dougherty says, soon the other members of the SS leadership began to be aware that they were faced by a major personality of enormous potential, that within a few years made him the most dreaded man in the Third Reich. Part of his rise was enabled by his ability to select young, very capable subordinates, usually, incidentally, from Central or Northern Germany, who, as Dougherty notes, were distinguished by the fact that not one had ever been a member of a Marxist, socialist, or even a liberal party. This is remarkable considering that Nazi is an abbreviation for Nationalist Socialist, and that no less a person than Himmler had considered moving to the Soviet Union. This is remarkable and confirms the truth that a fascist, which is what most of these men were, is nothing other really than an extreme, hardcore nationalist. Who were some of his early and notable hires? As Dougherty says, Alfred Najux, who became a specialist at dirty tricks, Walter Schellenberg, a crafty charmer who specialized in foreign relations, and Otto Ohlendorf, an early and dedicated Nazi who thrived as an irritant to the system. A fourth was Adolf Eichmann. Remember how Heydrich had said, "Knowledge is power"? Well, Walter Schellenberg noted of him, "The decisive thing for him was always to know more than others, whether it touched on the political, professional, or most intimate personal aspects of their lives, and to use this knowledge and the weakness of others to render them completely dependent on him. Dougherty concurs, adding, during the Great Pogrom of Kristallnacht in 1938, policemen under Heydrich's orders stood by while synagogues burned to the ground. But first they removed important documents. Later, the commandos he sent in behind invading German armies were giving standing orders to confiscate any interesting papers they found. This drive for knowledge also led to extensive revelations about the extensive corruption in the Nazi Party, so much so that Julius Streicher, publisher of the racist magazine Der Stürmer, became so enraged at the unvarnished way his corruption and sadism were presented that he complained to Hitler. The next step for the Nazis in consolidating control was to take over the police, replacing them with Goering's Gestapo. As Dougherty says, they took over a countrywide system of independent public police departments responsible for upholding national laws and transformed them in a mere 6 years into a secret security system independent of judicial review and ultimately responsible only to Hitler. And once they got control of regional police departments, they started targeting any and all possible opponents. Typical examples being communists, trade union officials, priests and clergymen, and liberals and Jews. They then focused on wresting control of the Gestapo itself from Goering. As Dougherty summarizes, in this den of inept conspirators, only Himmler and Heydrich possessed the ideal combination of attributes: flexibility of means coupled with single-mindedness of aim. In a war of all against all, two determined men who stick together are apt to win. In the end, Goering relinquished control of the Gestapo to Himmler and Heydrich. And all this of setting various secret police and intelligence agencies against each other represented Hitler's deliberate strategy and occurred with his awareness. The irony, however, is that while Heydrich's knowledge was the currency with which to gain advantage over others and to blackmail them, the man at the top of the hierarchy, Hitler, was constantly lied to, deceived by or not told important information by his subordinates. The next institution to eliminate, after the Nazi seizure of and consolidation of national power in 1933, was again one of their own, the huge 4 million strong Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary brown shirts led by gay Nazi Ernst Röhm. As Dougherty says, bursting into his old friend's room, Hitler yelled, "You are under arrest," and stormed out. Even before he left the room, squads of SS began dragging off Röhm's subordinates, starting with his chief of staff, Edmund Heines, whom they had surprised in bed with a young boy. Partly, Röhm got in trouble because he hadn't kowtowed to Hitler. As he himself had said of Hitler, what he wants is to sit on the hilltop and pretend he's God, and the rest of us who are itching to do something have got to sit around doing nothing. Are we revolutionaries or not? Röhm, ironically, was more open and less duplicitous than many of the newer Nazis, and not suited to playing their game of deception and manipulation. This enabled his easy destruction. Heydrich was directly instrumental in the purge. What did he tell his assassins and commandos? Pure lies. Putsch by Röhm. State of emergency. Order from the Führer. Immediate action. And then he sent them on their way to murder, with hundreds of SA members killed and the officer corps decimated. Afterwards, a super agency called the RSHA was formed, which consolidated numerous offices in 7 departments. The result couldn't have been more sinister. As Dougherty says, 2 years later, Adolf Eichmann was to begin directing the final solution of the Jewish question from a subdivision of the RSHA. Office 4, Gestapo, B, ideological enemies, 4, Jews. If we turn to the self-deception involved, how is it achieved? Partly by avoiding perceiving, feeling, and experiencing the horrors of their creation. A typical example here was when Heydrich sent an undercover agent, Hans-Jürgen Köhler, into the concentration camp Buchenwald to locate a prisoner who had hidden documents to find out where these were. The agent found the prisoner and the documents, but was irrevocably changed as a result of his brutal experience in the camp, since its ethical reality and nature were then inescapable as a result of his experience. Self-deception was again manifested by Lina Heydrich when the author attempted to inquire about two famous cases, that of General von Blomberg, when it came to light that he had married a former prostitute, and secondly, the case of mistaken identity of General Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, accused wrongly of engaging in homosexual liaisons. Hitler, misled into being angry at von Fritsch, and then the entire army staff took over leadership of the army, and by the time the mistake was discovered, Heydrich and Himmler had essentially covered their tracks. Lina, when asked about this case, simply decided at that point to make lunch for the author. Her self-deception was again manifested in her portrayal of the events of Kristallnacht, the period from the 9th and 10th of November 1938, when widespread looting and destruction of Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues occurred, and about 100 Jews were killed. Reinhard Heydrich played a defining role in this modern pogrom. Shortly after noon on the 9th, as the pogrom was already in progress, issuing the following decree with guidelines. Demonstrations against the Jews are to be expected throughout the Reich, and, number one, synagogues could be burned only if there was no danger of the fire spreading to nearby buildings. Number two, Jewish stores and apartments could be destroyed but not plundered. Looters were to be arrested. Number three, foreign citizens, even if Jewish, were not to be harmed. Number four, historically important Jewish archives were to be confiscated by the police to prevent their being burned. In addition, apart from failing to contain the violence, the SS also utilized the opportunity to arrest many rich Jews in order to ransom them later, then forcing them to leave the country, as was the current deportation policy. The essential thing was that Hitler had allowed Kristallnacht to proceed, after propaganda minister Goebbels had incited it, and so neither Himmler nor Heydrich naturally made any serious attempt to oppose Hitler's will and to restrict the violence, but only to profit from it. And what did Heydrich's wife say about Kristallnacht in 1975? It was a propaganda thing of Goebbels, but we had nothing to do with it. We only locked them up, let them go. That was the end of it. Dougherty said, "I've heard that many people were killed." "Ah, that's all a fairy tale. There were no dead. That belongs to the atrocity stories. There are still many such stories. Many." That was the degree of her self-deception. If we turn to Heydrich's personal life, we find that just as he surpassed his chief, Himmler, intellectually, he also surpassed him in his sexual and romantic affairs, with Himmler only having one mistress, but Heydrich regular dalliances with likely hundreds of different women, whose company he courted after work with other Nazi officials. As Dougherty says, Eichmann, Nayux, and Schellenberg all talked of long, tedious nights, drifting in and out of bars and cabarets, competing for the favors of women of dubious distinction. The next morning, Heydrich would act as if the whole thing had never happened. In this, as in everything else, deception and the compartmentalization of knowledge were key. In addition, Heydrich actually sponsored his own bordello, called Salon Kitty, in which microphones were installed to capture any information that might be gleaned from any of the high-ranking Nazis who dallied with the female agents there employed. Either for intelligence purposes or direct blackmail, this bordello was likely highly effective. And when it came time for Hitler to start World War II, he attempted to achieve a degree of plausible deniability in claiming that the Poles had actually invaded first. But behind this, of course, was Heydrich's master of dirty tricks, Albert Najux, who arranged for concentration camp prisoners to be dressed in Polish uniforms, drugged into quiescence, and then shot when the Nazi false flag phrase, "Grandmother is dead," was broadcast. Lina Heydrich, however, told the author that it was legitimate as a cover story. If the Germans had not attacked, war would have come sooner or later anyway, since Poland and Germany were totally at odds over disputed territory. Who knows what causes wars? She mused. Once the war begun, Heydrich and Himmler immediately moved to destroy the intelligentsia of Poland, creating roving death squads called Einsatzgruppen to exterminate anyone who even conceivably might offer resistance. As Heydrich said, "We'll spare the common folk, but the aristocrats, priests, and Jews must be killed." And in this, he was following Hitler's direct statement. Whatever we can find in the shape of an upper class in Poland is to be liquidated. As the war continued, these death squads and related groups were used to murder over 2 million people, typically, as Dougherty says, during a 2-day period in Kiev's Babi Yar ravine. Otto Rush's Einsatzgruppe executed more than 33,000 Jews. It was the largest such massacre up until that time. Constant dissimulation was used by Heydrich in the massacre reports passed on to other Nazi officials, as in the following situation report 6 sent by Heydrich to Ribbentrop on November 25, 1941. 222 Jews were shot in Russia because of anti-German propaganda, and 996 in Belarus because they sabotaged decrees of the German occupation authorities. Since they had participated in sabotage actions, another 627 Jews were shot. Because of a great danger of plague, the liquidation of the Jews of the ghetto in Belarus was begun. In Ukraine, 165 Jewish terrorists and 19 Jewish communists and 380 Jews were shot who had carried on agitation and atrocity propaganda against the German authorities. All these were excuses, of course, to grant a veneer of plausibility to murder. When it came to perhaps the most infamous meeting of all concerning the Holocaust and the Third Reich, the Wannsee Conference near Berlin in January of 1942, Heydrich played the decisive coordinating role. The motivation had been the incorporation of Poland with its huge number of Jews into the Third Reich. Given both Hitler and the Nazis' extreme racism and their propensity to extreme violence, physical extermination, as Heydrich had put it, was the result. As Dougherty says, at the Wannsee Conference, Heydrich himself broke the SS secrecy regulations and put in writing hidden policies of almost unbelievable horror, enough to damn everyone who attended, as well as the millions of people whose fate they had come to discuss. Again, here, Dougherty focuses in part on the language Heydrich used, which directly pertains to how human beings psychologically habituate themselves to tolerating and committing such acts. As she says, the uncomfortable word shot was gradually replaced by an endless efflorescence of euphemisms, removed, resettled, rendered harmless. Here too, in this 90-minute meeting and its protocol, as described later by Adolf Eichmann, to read this document is to become lost in the language of a bureaucratic rationality so insidious it can make mass murder seem ordinary, even a bit dull. Heydrich had arranged the whole show in the hopes that his guests would feel nothing. Here, for example, is some of the actual language used. Under appropriate direction, in the course of the final solution, the Jews are now to be suitably assigned to labor in the East. In big labor gangs with the sexes separated, Jews capable of work will be brought to these areas, employed in road building, in which task a large part will undoubtedly disappear through natural diminution. The remnant that may eventually remain, being undoubtedly the part most capable of resistance, will have to be appropriately dealt with, since it represents a natural selection and in the event of release is to be regarded as the germ cell of a new Jewish renewal. As usual, Lina Heydrich couldn't accept the reality of what her husband had orchestrated. Instead, in her words, "Over the final solution, I'm of entirely different mind from what's usually said. My husband never thought of death. He thought of resettlement. Where does it say murder? Where does it say kill? He said they had reserved a great area east of the Urals, and all the Jews from Germany and the German-occupied spheres were gathered there and resettled. But a final solution in the meaning of today, that's just an assumption." The author asks, "So you believe that all of these reports of mass murders are not true? That it never in life was the truth? Never. That it is technically not at all possible. It was once technically calculated how long it takes a person to be burnt up. Ask someone who is employed in a crematorium. At least 1.5 hours, and according to the calculation, a person must be burned up in 10 minutes for the numbers to be accurate. There are books about it that prove that." In this way, the self-deceived mind tries to deal with evil. The last major step in Heydrich's career occurred when he was designated the Reichsprotector, or administrative regent, of the conquered Czechoslovakia. Given that the Czechs had initially proved somewhat rebellious with student demonstrations, minor sabotage, constant illegal radio broadcasts, and work slackenings, how did Heydrich initially respond when he assumed the protectorate? As Dougherty says, in his first 24 hours in office, Heydrich declared a curfew, imposed martial law, arrested Prime Minister Elias, and put him on trial for treason, the highest official in any occupied land ever to be so treated. By the beginning of 1943, over 400 people had been executed and approximately 5,000 people sent to concentration camps. He said, "The first thing to do is to show the Czechs, for once, who is master in the house." His plan afterwards was for a gradual Germanization of the country. However, unbeknownst to Heydrich and all the members of the Nazi secret services, the Czech government in exile stationed in London had an entirely different definition of the word rebellious. To them, the country hadn't been rebellious enough, which led them to their plotting assassination. At the same time, as Dougherty describes it, the psychological pressures on the Nazis, given the brutal killers they were, and yet at the same time often men of high intellect and culture, imposed on them a type of dual personality, one needed for their official duties and the other for their families and friends, where they could be psychologically the persons they were before. Heydrich, in Prague, distant from Berlin and freer to fashion his own decisions, started treating the Czechs more leniently, indulging in the self-deceptive illusion that they would, in the end, appreciate this softer style of governance. As a result, he lost his suspiciousness and guardedness. As Dougherty says, instead of deferring to Hitler, Himmler, and Goering, Heydrich now enjoyed both external recognition and the company of entirely different men. He told Lina he was finding my way back to normal human relationships. And happy for Lina, she was able to join him with their 4 children in Prague. In line with this new approach, he granted, as Dougherty says, cheap lunches, vocational instruction, and free clothes and shoes. From bread, Heydrich moved on to circuses, distributing hundreds of thousands of tickets to an enticing range of unpolitical entertainments. Movies, musical plays, football games, concerts, all free. In April, he announced an ambitious new Social Security program for workers. Payments to the sick, the old, to widows and orphans were dramatically increased, sometimes as much as 75%. By now, however, the secret agents of the Czech government in exile had parachuted into the countryside 6 months ago were prepared to strike. And so on May 27, 1942, fearing that Heydrich would soon fly back to Berlin to perhaps be appointed by Hitler to a new French protectorate, agents Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis sprang into action. Stationing themselves at a hairpin turn on Heydrich's Prague estate, where his chauffeur of necessity slowed, Gabčík fired his machine gun, it however jamming at the decisive moment. Kubis, however, throwing a grenade which exploded at the rear of the car, wounded Heydrich, sending fragments into his spleen, diaphragm, and back. Subsequently taken to the hospital, Heydrich succumbed to his injuries 8 days later. Ironically, as Dougherty says, Heydrich's Machiavellian strategy of delaying the arrest of resistance leaders, coupled with the lack of empathy of an arrogant man certain his subjects must be grateful for such protection, made the assassination possible. Our author, after the denouement of her arch-villain, concludes by describing how the Nazis held an elaborate state funeral for their fallen leader, and then revenged themselves on the Czechs, razing the village of Lidice and killing its inhabitants. She also describes how Frau Heydrich and her children finished the last 3 years of the war and their varied experiences afterwards in post-war Germany. There are many lessons one could draw from this book and ways to use it as a starting point for other topics. A study of the Second World War, the Nazis, the political and psychological nature and methods of totalitarianism, and the Holocaust. Here, given my own interest in the deception and self-deception embodied in all ideologies, I have tried throughout to highlight these instances. In finishing, I'd like to ask the following question. When contemplating the enormous evil of moral monsters like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Hitler and his henchmen, and Mussolini, what portion of the total societal harm that these individuals caused was due to the evil in their hearts, and what portion due to the system, whether communistic or fascistic, which facilitated their evil? Now, many people would say the evil characters of these individuals was the most important factor, but I would disagree. Stalin without communism was just a petty street thug. Lenin, a failed Marxist revolutionary. Mao, a librarian. And Hitler, without fascism, a failed landscape painter. But once again, these figures were enabled by their communism and fascism to access and collect an enormous degree of personal and political state power. What happened then? These minor societal failures and criminals that they were enabled to wreak enormous harm on civilization through the centralized power of these totalitarian states, which greatly amplified their evil impulses and power. In conclusion, this book certainly deserves an A. Miss Dougherty excels in every respect, giving us enormous detail about Reinhard and Lina's lives, the political, military, and social context in which their lives were embedded, and with her masterful use of empathy and her ability to forge an intimate relationship with Lina, reveals the deceptions and self-deceptions that facilitated the civilizational catastrophe of the Holocaust and Second World War. In the hope that all of us can reduce our own level of self-deception, which can lead to so much harm, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.